Imagine this. You walk into a luxury mall in New York. Glass, marble, soft music. Everything glows gold. You pass a jewelry display. A diamond ring catches your eye. The tag says $80,000. You know the brand. You trust it. But what if I told you the real power behind that diamond doesn't come from Paris, or London, or New York? It comes from deep inside Africa, from a name almost no one knows. The Kimbala Group. No public ads, no press conferences. Yet this group quietly controls billions in luxury and energy. They own parts of diamond mines in Botswana, oil pipelines running through Angola, gold refineries in Ghana, and luxury fashion investments across Europe. But here's what's strange. There are almost no records. Their executives rarely appear in photos. Their offices look like ordinary buildings. Still, everyone in Africa's high circles knows if Kimbala is involved, the deal is already decided. They don't ask for attention. They move in silence. While others chase fame, they chase influence. But how did this invisible empire rise? And why does almost no one talk about it? Because Kimbala doesn't act like a company. It acts like a shadow government of wealth. And the deeper you look, the more you realize this is not just about business. It's about power, legacy, and the right to shape a continent's story. In this film, we'll uncover how the Kimbala Group began from nothing, how it grew to dominate Africa's luxury and power industries. Let me show you exactly how this happened, and how its influence now reaches far beyond the continent. It's a story that few dare to tell, but once you understand how this empire works, you'll see the global luxury world in a completely new light. Because the truth behind Africa's hidden billionaires is far more surprising and more powerful than you've ever imagined. Let's go back to where it all started. To understand the Kimbala Group, we have to travel back to the 1970s. Africa was changing fast. Independence was new, but power still lived overseas. Foreign companies controlled the gold, the diamonds, the oil. Africa supplied the world, but owned almost nothing. And then came one man who refused to accept that. Joseph Kimbala. He wasn't born rich. He grew up in a small mining town in Zambia, watching foreign workers drive fancy cars while locals lived on dirt roads. He once said to a friend, "They take our gold, but we never touch the shine." Joseph wanted to change that. He earned a scholarship to study in London. While others studied economics, Joseph studied how power moved, who signed the checks, who owned the ports, who set the prices. By 1978, he returned home with a plan. Africa needed its own empire, one that could stand toe-to-toe with Western corporations. So he started small, a single transport company, moving goods between Zambia and South Africa. Then a trade license to export gold dust. He built slowly, quietly. When others chased fast money, Joseph chased connections. He partnered with chiefs who controlled land, ministers who signed permits, and bankers who could move cash across borders. He didn't fight the system, he learned to outsmart it. By the mid-1980s, his company, Kimbala Holdings, had become the silent backbone of African trade routes. He didn't just own trucks. He owned information: who was buying, who was selling, who was desperate. And that's where the magic started. He began creating a web of companies, small, forgettable names scattered across Mauritius, Kenya, Switzerland, and Dubai. Each one handled a piece of his empire: shipping, minerals, banking, energy. Each one pointed to another until no one could tell who really owned what. That's what insiders later called the Kimbala method. You can see it today in global elites, invisible, untouchable, yet everywhere. By the early 1990s, whispers of Kimbala money spread from Nairobi to Johannesburg. No one knew how big his empire was, but everyone knew if Kimbala invested, the future of that region was about to change. And that's when something unexpected happened. Now here's where things get really interesting. By the early 1990s, Joseph Kimbala had become a legend, but not the kind that appeared in magazines. He was the man behind the deal. When new gold mines opened, his trucks were already hauling the first loads. When governments signed contracts, his lawyers had drafted the early drafts months before. Kimbala didn't chase opportunities. He created them, And here's the genius of it, he never tried to own everything directly. Instead, he built a web of control. In diamonds, he partnered with local miners but secretly held the export rights. In gold, he didn't own the mines, he owned the refineries that processed every ounce. In oil, he didn't run rigs. He controlled the shipping routes and storage facilities. Control the flow, not the source. That was the Kimbala rule. It meant he could profit even when others failed. If prices dropped, he'd still make money through logistics. If governments changed, he still owned the supply chain. By 1995, his empire stretched from the Congo's copper belt to the ports of Mozambique. More than 60 companies, each under different names, run by trusted allies. But none of them carried his signature. On paper, Kimbala barely existed. In reality, he owned nearly everything that moved through the continent's luxury trade. Then came the move that changed everything. Europe. Joseph saw that Africa's raw materials fed Europe's luxury market. Diamonds for jewelry, gold for watches, oil for fashion logistics. But Africa didn't own the brands. Europe did. So, he quietly started buying small stakes in Western luxury companies, always through shell firms and offshore trusts. A 2% share here, a 5% stake there. Enough to sit at the table, never enough to draw attention. By 1998, insiders in Geneva whispered that African money had entered Europe's luxury circuit. No one could confirm it, but everyone knew who it meant. Kimbala had shifted the game. He wasn't just exporting wealth, he was importing influence. And then, he did something even more unusual. He started funding art galleries and cultural foundations. To most, it looked like philanthropy. But behind closed doors, it was smart PR, reputation insurance for a global future. He knew that sooner or later, Africa's image would become its greatest export. And when that day came, he wanted to own the story. By the early 2000s, Joseph Kimbala had built something no one could touch. A silent empire tied together by gold, oil, and trust. But even empires have to evolve. And Joseph knew his time was running out. That's when he began grooming his heirs, the next generation of Kimbalas, to take the empire global. But if you think that was the peak of his power, wait until by the early 2000s, the Kimbala Empire had become a continent-wide machine, but to the outside world, it barely existed. No press releases, no flashy offices, just quiet movement. That was Joseph Kimbala's greatest achievement, building massive power under complete silence. He used something known in finance as corporate layering, a system of hiding ownership through layers of companies, each owning another, each registered in a different country. One in Mauritius, another in Luxembourg, another in Dubai. Each looked harmless. Together, they formed a maze that no outsider could map. If you tried to trace who owned a Kimbala diamond mine, you'd find a small logistics company. That company was owned by an investment trust. The trust was managed by another holding firm. And that firm was owned by no one you could name. It was a masterpiece of invisibility. Even his employees didn't always know who paid them. Their salaries came from banks in Singapore, Switzerland, or Nairobi, depending on what part of the empire they served. When reporters tried to dig, they hit walls of lawyers in silence. Documents disappeared. Company records changed overnight. One journalist from Johannesburg reportedly said, "Kimbala doesn't hide behind money. He hides behind confusion." But secrecy wasn't just protection, it was strategy. Kimbala believed that when you remove your name from your power, you make your power last longer. And he was right. While others chased fame, he built an invisible legacy. Behind closed doors, he created what some insiders called the core, a small circle of 12 advisors who knew everything. Trade routes, bank codes, secret partners. They met twice a year in private villas, often under fake names, phones left outside. Their job was simple: protect the empire, expand the reach, erase the traces. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. Kimbala wasn't just avoiding taxes or politics. He was preparing for succession, a handover of power to his children. He knew that visibility destroyed dynasties, so he built the system like a fortress, where even if one company fell, a dozen more would rise in its place. In 2004, Joseph Kimbala passed away quietly. No public funeral, no headlines. His death was announced only to insiders. Yet within 24 hours, the empire kept moving, ships sailed, contracts closed, money flowed. It was as if nothing had happened. Because that was the point, the system was built to outlive the man. And soon, a new generation would take control. One that didn't just want to protect the empire, but to push it into the world's spotlight. Now meet the heirs of Africa's invisible dynasty. When Joseph Kimbala died in 2004, the world didn't notice. There were no obituaries, no photos, no public mourning. But behind closed doors, 3 private jets took off from 3 different countries. One from Paris, one from Dubai, and one from Johannesburg. On board were his children, Aisha, David, and Malik Kimbala. They hadn't lived in their father's shadow. They had been trained inside it. From a young age, Joseph had sent them to elite schools, London, Geneva, Cape Town. But their lessons weren't in classrooms. They learned how to read power, how to hide wealth, and how to control narratives. Now, with their father gone, the siblings faced a choice: dismantle the empire or take it global. They chose both. Aisha Kimbala, the eldest, became the face, or rather, the mask of the group's public side. She focused on art, philanthropy, and luxury. She hosted charity galas in Monaco, quietly mingling with CEOs and princes. Every photo she appeared in looked glamorous, yet revealed nothing about what she truly owned. David Kimbala, the second-born, took over energy and logistics. He was the architect of Kimbala Energy Holdings, a company that moved oil and natural gas across Africa. But while the world talked about renewable energy, David was buying up strategic pipelines and storage hubs. If you controlled where energy flowed, you controlled who had light and who didn't. And then there was Malik, the youngest but the most mysterious. He hated cameras, never attended public events, and spoke only through encrypted calls. He reportedly built the group's private intelligence network, a team of ex-bankers, analysts, and cybersecurity experts. Their mission: track global markets, predict crises, and keep the empire one step ahead. Together, the siblings turned Kimbala from a hidden empire into a global force. They didn't just control resources anymore, they began shaping taste and trend. They invested in fashion brands, jewelry houses, and luxury real estate in London, Dubai, and Nairobi. But they never appeared on Forbes lists. They didn't need validation, they had access. You see, while most billionaires buy attention, the Kimbalas buy silence. They fund what others fear to mention. They build through shadows. It's said that when the world faces economic shocks, like the 2008 crisis, Kimbala quietly profits. They move before the markets because they see before others do. And while they claim to support African development, critics whisper that they've mastered the art of soft control. Instead of owning governments, they own decisions. And that's where their story takes a turn. Because soon, their influence would stretch far beyond Africa, into Europe, Asia, and the US. And the way they did it will change how you see luxury forever. But if you think this is just about wealth, wait until you see what happens next. By 2010, the world had changed. Africa was no longer the world's quiet supplier. It was becoming the world's new battlefield for power. China was building highways and rail lines. America was sending investors and diplomats. Europe was trying to hold onto what little influence it had left. And somewhere in the middle of it all stood the Kimbala Empire. They didn't wear suits in boardrooms. They wore silence like armor. While politicians shook hands for cameras, Kimbala Group quietly moved billions behind closed doors. Their strategy? Let everyone think they're helping, but always own the ground they're standing on. It started in Angola, a new oil field discovered off the coast. The government celebrated with fireworks, but deep inside the contract, buried under layers of shell companies, was Kimbala Holdings. They owned 14% of the operation. Then came Kenya. A major tech boom was happening. Foreign investors rushed in, buying land and building data centers. But when it came time to power those servers, Kimbala Energy controlled the grid. And in South Africa, something even more subtle took place. a luxury diamond brand launched, pure, elegant, with African roots and Parisian design. Celebrities wore it on red carpets. But behind that sparkling name stood a familiar signature, Aisha Kimbala. By 2015, the empire had gone borderless. No single country could claim them. They were everywhere and nowhere. Their wealth flowed through Mauritius, Dubai, and Switzerland. Their corporations registered in places no one could trace. And their influence reached all the way to New York. Here's where things get even stranger. In 2017, a quiet investment fund appeared in Manhattan. It began buying shares in luxury brands, from watches to yachts to private jets. No one knew the owner, but leaked documents later revealed that the fund was controlled by a holding company tied to Lagos and Geneva. Yes, Kimbala again. They weren't just Africa's empire anymore. They were the unknown shareholders behind the global luxury system. Reportedly, one of their firms even supplied gold to European jewelry brands. Not directly, but through middlemen and export networks stretching from Ghana to the United Arab Emirates. And every time a diamond sparkled on a magazine cover, a silent cut, a fraction of a percent, flowed back to Kimbala accounts. That's how deep their roots had grown. But with power that massive comes danger. Soon, their name began to appear in intelligence reports. Some said they were influencing elections. Others claimed they were funding peace projects that conveniently aligned with their business zones. Still, nothing was proven. They were ghosts, perfectly legal, impeccably hidden. But behind every empire that grows too fast, there's always a breaking point. And for the Kimbalas, it came in the form of a single man, a whistleblower, an insider who claimed he had seen the dark side of the empire's expansion. He disappeared before the world could hear his story. But his leaked files? They told a story that would shake governments and expose just how powerful this African dynasty had become. Now, here's where things take a shocking turn, because those files didn't just name African officials, they mentioned global banks, royal families, and even Western corporations. The Kimbalas weren't following the system. They were helping design it. And that right there changed everything. It began with a single encrypted email, sent from an unknown server in Europe. Subject line, "You don't know what you're part of." The message landed in the inbox of a French investigative journalist, Amélie Laurent. First, she thought it was a prank, but attached to the email were over 600 confidential documents, contracts, bank transfers, ownership charts. Every page pointed to one name, Kimbala Holdings International. The sender called himself M. He claimed to be a former financial auditor for one of the group's offshore entities in Geneva. And according to him, what the world saw as a luxury investment empire was something far deeper. A global influence network built on African wealth, Western silence, and invisible control. He wrote, "They don't buy companies. They buy decisions. They build narratives, not brands." It was a cryptic message. But as Amélie dug deeper, the truth unfolded like a slow explosion. One file detailed the transfer of $380 million through a Mauritius-based firm, money that ended up funding political campaigns in 3 African countries. Another revealed ownership in a rare earth mining project in Congo, minerals essential for global tech. The official owner? A shell company linked to an Italian art gallery. Amélie realized she was holding evidence of an empire that had mastered the art of invisibility. And then came the most shocking part. Among the leaked files was a name, Malik Kimbala, listed as a strategic advisor to a European Energy Council. The same man who had supposedly disappeared from public life years earlier. It raised a chilling question. Had the Kimbalas moved from business into geopolitics? The deeper Amélie went, the more her sources warned her to stop. Some messages were deleted before she could read them. Her apartment was broken into, but nothing was stolen except her laptop. Still, she pressed on, because one pattern kept appearing across the data. Whenever the Kimbala group invested in a region, chaos followed, then recovery, then dependence. It was a silent formula. Destabilize, rebuild, control. She published her first story in 2018 under the title, "The Invisible Empire: How One Family Shapes Africa's Future." It went viral for 24 hours, then disappeared. Links were deleted, accounts suspended. Even the magazine that hosted it took it down, claiming legal concerns. But copies remained, scattered across forums and encrypted networks. And while the world forgot, others took notice. In Washington, London, and Beijing, analysts began whispering, "Who are these people? How did they get this powerful?" The whistleblower M vanished soon after. No trace, no follow-up. But his final note to Amelie read, "They aren't the future of Africa. They are the architects of its ownership." And that line, haunting, poetic, and terrifying, spread like wildfire in private circles. The Kimbala Empire wasn't just another wealthy dynasty. They were becoming a hidden superpower, moving pieces on a global chessboard where money was just the first move. But here's the question no one could answer. Who were they really working with? Because behind every empire that's secretive, there's always someone even more powerful in the shadows. And that's exactly what Part 8 uncovers. By the time the Kimbala files began circulating privately among intelligence agencies, the story had outgrown Africa. This was no longer about one family. It was about who stood behind them. For years, the Kimbalas were thought to be independent, a rare African dynasty that built its wealth without outside help. But according to sources familiar with international finance, that was only half true. Because behind their offshore companies were silent investors, names that appeared only in coded documents, hidden under layers of corporate secrecy. One stood out, a Swiss investment group known as Helios Consortium AG. On paper, it managed art funds and real estate, but in reality, it reportedly handled strategic wealth for old European families, the kind of names that rarely appear in public. Helios had deep roots in the Oppenheimer network, the South African diamond dynasty that once controlled much of the continent's mining wealth. Analysts believe the Kimbalas became their local face, a bridge between old colonial wealth and the new African elite. It made perfect sense. Helios provided the global access. Kimbala provided the local control. Together, they built an invisible alliance, one that could move billions across borders without raising flags. But that wasn't all. Buried in the files was another connection, one that reached even farther. Documents pointed to a Middle Eastern sovereign fund, reportedly based in Abu Dhabi. That fund had quietly invested in Kimbala Energy and a luxury holding in Dubai. In return, Kimbala gave them access to rare earth minerals in Africa. It was a perfect exchange. Power for resources, luxury for loyalty. Even more surprising were links to Western luxury houses. One report suggested that Kimbala-backed companies owned supply chain stakes in high-end European watch brands, not directly, but through middle entities that handled raw materials. So, every time a luxury watch was sold in Paris, a silent fraction of profit might have traveled back to Kimbala's networks. This was a level of influence no African dynasty had achieved before. They weren't just part of the system, they were woven into it. And yet, they stayed invisible. No interviews, no public boards, only whispers. But here's where it gets darker. Multiple sources suggested that the Kimbala Group had a private meeting in Monaco in 2019, with several European billionaires and a Gulf prince. The agenda? Reportedly, the creation of a new luxury conglomerate spanning Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. The plan was simple: build a brand that redefines the origin of wealth. It wasn't about selling luxury. It was about rewriting who controlled it. And according to insiders, that meeting marked the birth of a secret initiative known only as Project Renaissance. No one knows exactly what Project Renaissance entails. Some say it's a fund for art, real estate, and innovation. Others whisper it's a soft power program, an attempt to shift the narrative of wealth, influence, and ownership from the West to the global South. Whatever it was, by 2020, new entities began appearing in corporate registries. Companies with names like Renaissance Holdings, Nova Africa Capital, and the Legacy Group Ltd. Each was connected, in small ways, to Kimbala. Each quietly acquired properties, brands, or land, all under the radar. And yet, through all of this, Aisha, David, and Malik remained silent. No one knew where they were. No one knew what they were planning next. But then came the pandemic and everything changed. Because while the world stopped, the Kimbala Empire expanded. And what they did next proved they weren't just surviving global chaos. They were shaping it. This is where the empire's true power revealed itself. It was 2020. Airports shut down. Borders closed. The world froze in fear. But while people stayed inside, the Kimbala Empire moved. When markets collapsed, they didn't panic, they prepared. While others sold off assets, Kimbala Holdings bought them. Luxury hotels in Marrakesh, beachfront resorts in Zanzibar, high-end apartment towers in Johannesburg, all suddenly acquired through silent partnerships. And they didn't stop there. Through offshore vehicles registered in Dubai and Singapore, the group began investing in digital infrastructure, data centers, payment apps, and logistics tech. Why? Because in chaos, control isn't about owning gold or oil anymore. It's about owning information. One insider reportedly said, when everyone else was buying masks, they were buying data. Across Africa, governments needed fast solutions, vaccines, internet systems, digital ID programs. Many turned to private partners. Some of those partners, according to leaked documents, were fronts for Kimbala-linked companies. And just like that, the empire moved from luxury and energy into the heart of governance itself. Think about it, controlling who gets light, who gets paid, and who gets connected. That's more than wealth. That's power at the system level. But while the world struggled, Kimbala's image improved. Aisha launched the Renaissance Foundation, donating millions to rebuild African economies. She gave interviews, careful, polished, philanthropic. Every answer ended with the same message. Africa can lead the world if we own our story. It sounded inspiring, and maybe it was. But behind the scenes, the foundation's main contractor was reportedly a holding firm connected to the family's logistics arm. So every dollar that went out somehow came back in. That's genius and terrifying. Meanwhile, Malik, the invisible brother, resurfaced. He was rumored to have moved to Singapore, creating a private investment algorithm that could predict commodity trends weeks before markets reacted. If true, that meant Kimbala could buy low, sell high, and profit before the world even realized what was happening. And the numbers spoke for themselves. By late 2021, analysts estimated their combined network of companies was worth over $60 billion. Yet not one of them appeared on Forbes or Bloomberg lists, because technically they didn't own the companies, their trusts did. Their secrecy wasn't a weakness. It was their armor. They had become the hidden heartbeat of luxury and power across Africa. Their mines supplied gold to Western jewelers. Their energy powered growing cities. Their funds backed fashion startups that shaped global trends. And while most corporations followed governments, Kimbala influenced them. Quietly, efficiently, without attention. By 2022, even Western policymakers were starting to notice. An internal report by a European financial task force allegedly warned that an emerging African financial network is influencing luxury and energy sectors at an unprecedented scale. The name wasn't mentioned, but the fingerprints, unmistakable. Then came one final move, the one that cemented their power forever. A new headquarters, not in London, Paris, or New York, but in Nairobi, inside a futuristic glass tower rumored to have been financed entirely in cash. The media called it a symbol of modern Africa, but insiders knew better. It was a fortress, the visible heart of an invisible empire. And as the lights of that tower lit up for the first time, one thing became clear. While the world fought to survive, the Kimbalas had quietly taken control of tomorrow. But that leaves one final question. What's their real goal? Because money was never enough. This empire wanted something far greater, something history itself couldn't ignore. And that revelation is what we uncover next. The year is 2025. A warm night settles over Nairobi. The skyline glows, glass, steel, and gold. And at the very center stands the Kimbala Tower, shining like a new beacon for Africa. From the outside, it looks like progress. But inside those mirrored walls, something far more strategic is unfolding. Because this was never just about money, never just about luxury. This was about rewriting who holds power. You see, for centuries, Africa supplied the world gold, diamonds, oil, talent. But the profits flowed outward. The narrative was written elsewhere. The Kimbala family wanted to change that, to bring control and the story back home. But the way they did it, that's where the controversy lies. They didn't fight with governments or armies. They used influence. They used ownership. And most of all, they used silence. Every deal they made, every partnership they built was designed for one purpose: to make Africa indispensable to the luxury world. From the gold in Swiss watches, to the diamonds on Hollywood red carpets, to the energy powering global factories, the thread leads back here. And if you think that's coincidence, think again. Because when you control the resources that define global elegance, you don't just sell products. You define status itself. And the Kimbalas knew that power doesn't come from attention. It comes from being needed by those who already have it. Now, sources close to the family say their next move is something called the Legacy Project, a quiet initiative to build luxury cities across Africa, sustainable, secure, designed for global elites. But behind the glass and greenery, critics believe it's a strategy to centralize influence even further. One insider described it as Africa's version of Dubai, but privately owned. And if that's true, it means the empire is no longer just reacting to the world. It's shaping what the next century will look like. But here's the twist that few saw coming. Recently, leaked documents suggest that parts of the Kimbala fortune are being funneled into education, tech schools, leadership programs, and innovation hubs. They're training a generation of young Africans in finance, design, and AI. Maybe that's control. Maybe that's vision. Maybe it's both. Because perhaps the real plan was never about keeping power hidden. It was about passing it on, but on their own terms. And that's the paradox of the Kimbala Empire. They may have started in the shadows, but everything they built points toward a future bathed in light. A future where Africa isn't just a supplier, but a center. A place where wealth, creativity, and influence flow outward, not away. Still, no one knows how far their reach truly goes. Their companies remain unlisted. Their assets, fragmented. Their faces rarely seen. Maybe that's how they'll stay. Or maybe one day the world will finally see them, not as ghosts of power, but as architects of a new age. One thing's for sure, the empire isn't gone. It's evolving. And as long as there's luxury, ambition, and mystery in the world, the Kimbala name will whisper through it all. In every age, power hides in plain sight. Some rule from thrones, others from silence. The Kimbala Empire built both. Not for fame, not for applause, but to remind the world that true power, the kind that lasts, doesn't shout. It whispers, and the world listens. If this story opened your eyes, hit subscribe because we're just getting started. In our next episode, we'll explore the real billion-dollar race to control Africa's future, from rare earth minerals to luxury influence.